In the vast expanse of Montana's Glacier Valley, where the wind carries secrets across endless prairies and the mountains stand like ancient sentinels, there lived a man who spoke the language of wild horses. Cole Matheson could come a bucking. Bronco, with nothing but his voice and gentle hands, could read the soul of a Mustang in the flick of an ear or the arch of a neck. But on a frost-bitten morning in November 1889, he would meet someone who would shatter everything he thought he knew about taming wild hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by young Timothy Fletcher, who rode his pony hard from Copper Falls, his breath forming white clouds in the crisp autumn air. Cole Matheson stood in the corral, working with a particularly stubborn paint mare who'd been brought in 3 days prior, her coat a canvas of brown and white patches that reminded him of storm clouds breaking over wheat fields. The horse had been running with a wild herd for most of her life, and her eyes held that familiar mixture of fear and defiance that Cole had learned to recognize in all creatures who'd tasted freedom and had it stolen away. The boy's urgent call broke through the morning stillness. Cole turned, his weathered hands still extended toward the mare, who took the opportunity to retreat to the far corner of the enclosure, nostrils flaring. At 32, Cole had the kind of face that spoke of long days under the Montana sun and longer nights spent in contemplation. His dark hair, perpetually tousled by wind, fell across his forehead as he approached the fence where Timothy waited, clutching the yellow paper like it contained fire. "Mr. Matheson," the boy panted. "This came through the wire station. They said it was urgent." Cole accepted the telegram with hands that had gentled 1,000-pound animals but suddenly felt unsteady. The paper crinkled as he unfolded it, and the words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah passed suddenly. Consumption took her fast. "Come home. Father is dying too. Ranch failing. Need you. Brother James." The world seemed to tilt slightly off its axis. Sarah Whitmore, the woman he'd loved with the fierce devotion of a man who loved rarely but completely, was gone. They'd been engaged once, 3 years ago, before pride and stubborn words had driven them apart. She'd married his younger brother James in what Cole had convinced himself was an act of spite, though deep down he knew it was his own fault for letting her slip away. Now she was dead, and James was calling him back to the family ranch he'd sworn never to see again. Cole folded the telegram carefully, as if treating it with reverence might somehow change its contents. Timothy shifted nervously on his pony, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding it. "Will there be a reply, sir?" "Not yet, boy. Thank you for riding out." Timothy nodded and wheeled his pony around, galloping back toward town with the reckless abandon of youth. Cole stood alone in the corral, the telegram weighing heavier in his pocket than any saddle he'd ever carried. The paint mare had approached the fence again, drawn by some instinct that recognized grief. Her large, dark eyes studied him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The Matheson family ranch, Broken Arrow, lay 60 miles southeast of Copper Falls, nestled in a valley where the Yellowstone River carved its way through land that had been in their family for 23 years. Cole's father, Jeremiah Matheson, had staked his claim there in 1866, a Civil War veteran with a dream of building something lasting from the Montana soil. He'd married Cole's mother, Rebecca, a schoolteacher from St. Louis who'd come west with her sister and decided to stay for the adventure of it all. Cole had grown up on that ranch, learned to ride before he could properly walk, spent countless hours with his father learning to read the land, the weather, the subtle signs that meant the difference between a good year and a hard winter. But it was his gift with horses that had set him apart. Even as a child, he could approach the most skittish animal and somehow communicate without words, earning trust through patience and intuition. James had been born 4 years after Cole, a golden-haired boy with their mother's gentle nature and their father's quick smile. Where Cole was serious and introspective, James was charming and social, the kind of person who could make friends with anyone and light up a room simply by entering it. Cole loved his brother fiercely, protected him from schoolyard bullies, and taught him everything he knew about horses and cattle and the 100 small skills required to make a ranch prosper. The trouble had started when Sarah Whitmore's family moved to the valley in the summer of 1885. Her father, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, had come to establish a medical practice in the growing town of Cedar Ridge, bringing with him his wife Helen and their only daughter. Sarah was 22 then, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and eyes the color of summer sage. She was educated, having attended a teacher's college in Denver, but she also possessed a practical intelligence and a love of the outdoors that made her seem perfectly suited to frontier life. Cole had met her at a church social, drawn by her laughter and the way she spoke to everyone with genuine interest, from the banker's wife to the blacksmith's apprentice. She didn't put on airs despite her education and city upbringing, and when she looked at Cole, she seemed to see something in him that he wasn't even sure existed. They'd begun courting that autumn, long rides across the prairie, quiet conversations by the river, stolen kisses under the vast Montana sky. For 2 years, Cole allowed himself to believe that he'd found something precious and rare. Sarah understood his silences, appreciated his gift with animals, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the simple pleasures of ranch life. She would sit on the corral fence and watch him work with difficult horses, offering gentle encouragement and celebrating each small victory. When he'd finally worked up the courage to propose, in the spring of 1887, she'd said yes without hesitation, her eyes bright with tears of joy. But Cole had always struggled with self-doubt, a voice in his head that whispered he wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of such happiness. When Sarah's father had suggested she might want to continue her education, perhaps spend a year in San Francisco studying at a women's academy, Cole had interpreted it as a sign that she was growing tired of their simple life. Instead of discussing his fears with Sarah, he'd become withdrawn and moody, picking fights over trivial matters and pushing her away with the cruel efficiency of someone who'd convinced himself he was protecting her from making a mistake. The final argument had come in late summer, over something so insignificant that Cole couldn't even remember the details now. What he remembered was the hurt in Sarah's eyes, the way her voice had shaken when she'd asked him if he even wanted to marry her anymore. Pride had sealed his lips when he should have fallen to his knees and begged her forgiveness. Instead, he'd stood there like a stone statue while she removed his ring and placed it gently on the porch railing. "If you change your mind," she'd said, "you know where to find me." But Cole had been too proud and too convinced of his own unworthiness to change his mind. He'd watched from a distance as James, kind-hearted James who'd always looked up to his older brother, had begun spending time with Sarah, offering the companionship and emotional support that Cole had been too foolish to provide. When they'd announced their engagement 6 months later, Cole had congratulated them both with a smile that felt like broken glass in his mouth. Unable to bear watching them build a life together, Cole had sold his share of the family ranch to James and moved north to Copper Falls, where he'd established himself as a horse trainer specializing in wild Mustangs. The work suited his temperament and his skills, the long hours alone with animals who required nothing from him but patience and understanding. He'd built a small but solid reputation, and ranchers from across the territory brought him their problem horses, the ones deemed too wild or too dangerous for conventional methods. The years had passed quietly, punctuated by occasional letters from home that Cole read with a mixture of longing and regret. James and Sarah had married in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Ridge Church. Their first child, a daughter they'd named Rebecca after Cole's mother, had been born the following spring. James wrote of his struggles to keep the ranch profitable in increasingly difficult times, of their father's declining health, of Sarah's work establishing a small school for the valley's children. Cole had sent gifts for the baby, money when James hinted at financial difficulties, but he'd never returned home. He'd convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, staying away to avoid causing pain or awkwardness. In truth, he was a coward, afraid to face what he'd given up, afraid to see Sarah happy with his brother when he lay awake nights, remembering the feel of her hand in his dot. Now Sarah was dead, and James was summoning him home to a dying father and a failing ranch. The irony wasn't lost on him that the wild horses he gentled daily were easier to handle than his own stubborn heart. The paint mare in the corral seemed to sense his turmoil, approaching the fence with cautious steps, her ears pricked forward in concern. Cole reached out slowly, the way he'd learned to approach all wounded creatures, and the mare allowed him to stroke her neck. Her coat was rough from years of running free, marked with scars from thorns and fences and the general hardships of an unprotected life. But her eyes were intelligent and kind, holding none of the bitter anger that sometimes festered in animals who'd been truly broken by cruel treatment. "You understand, don't you, girl?" Cole murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes running away seems like the only choice, even when it's not." The mare whickered softly, as if in agreement. Cole continued stroking her neck, finding comfort in the simple connection. Animals, he'd learned, didn't judge or hold grudges the way people did. They lived in the present moment, responding to how they were treated now rather than nursing old wounds or fears. It was a lesson he'd never been able to apply to his own life. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his melancholy reverie. Tom Bradley, the owner of the Double Diamond Ranch, rode up on his bay gelding, his weathered face creased with the kind of worry that spoke of serious business. Tom had been one of Cole's first clients in Copper Falls, a gruff but fair man who'd trusted him with a string of Mustangs that other trainers had given up on. "Cole," Tom called out, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. "Heard young Fletcher riding hard through town this morning. Everything all right?" Cole pulled the telegram from his pocket, staring at it for a moment before meeting Tom's concerned gaze. "Family trouble. My brother's wife passed, and my father's dying. They need me back home." Tom's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that, son. When will you be leaving?" "I don't know yet," Cole admitted. "Haven't even decided if I'm going." The older man raised an eyebrow. "That's a peculiar thing to say about a family in need." Cole turned back to the paint. Mare, unable to meet Tom's eyes. "It's complicated." "Family usually is." Tom joined him at the fence, studying the horse with an experienced eye. "You've made good progress with this one. She was fighting the halter something fierce when I brought her in. She just needed to learn she could trust again," Cole said. "Someone hurt her once, probably tried to break her with rough handling." "She's not mean, just scared," Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Funny how that works. Sometimes the wildest ones just need someone who understands their language." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both men lost in their own thoughts. Tom Bradley had known loss himself, had buried a wife and son to scarlet fever 10 years earlier, and Cole respected his judgment on matters of the heart more than he cared to admit. "You know," Tom said finally, "I've been watching you work with horses for 3 years now, and I've never seen you fail to win one over eventually. Even the ones that seemed hopeless at first." "Horses are different," Cole replied. "They don't hold grudges." "Maybe not," Tom agreed. "But they do remember kindness. And they can sense when someone truly cares about their welfare." Cole knew the older man was trying to offer guidance without being pushy about it, and he appreciated the gentle approach. Tom had never pried into Cole's past or the reasons he'd left his family's ranch, but he'd probably guessed that there was more to the story than simple wanderlust. "The paint mare there," Tom continued, "she's been running free for maybe 6-7 years. Built up all kinds of defenses, learned not to trust because trusting had brought her pain. But look at her now. As if summoned by their conversation, the mare approached the fence again, clearly hoping for more of the gentle attention Cole had been providing. Her transformation over the past 3 days had been remarkable, from a wild-eyed, panic-stricken animal to this curious, increasingly trusting creature. What are you saying, Tom? I'm saying maybe some things are worth fighting for, even when they seem impossible. Maybe especially then. Cole appreciated the sentiment, but Tom didn't understand the full situation. The guilt Cole carried wasn't just about losing Sarah to another man. It was about the way he'd treated her, the pride that had blinded him to her love, the years of silence that had probably convinced her he didn't care. Even if James was willing to welcome him home, how could he face the memory of the woman he'd loved and lost through his own stubborn foolishness? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I should check on the other horses, Cole said, deflecting the conversation. The buckskin in the far corral has been favoring his left front hoof. Tom nodded, understanding that the moment for deeper conversation had passed. I'll head back to town then. If you decide to go home, don't worry about the mare. I'll have my boys come get her and finish the work elsewhere. That's not necessary. She deserves better than being shuffled around again. Then I guess you'd better figure out what you're going to do, Tom said with a slight smile. Because that horse has gotten attached to you, and starting over with someone new might set her back considerably. After Tom rode away, Cole spent the rest of the morning working with his other charges, but his heart wasn't in it. The telegram seemed to burn in his pocket, a constant reminder of the choice he faced. He could stay in Copper Falls, continue his quiet life among the horses, and let James handle their father's death and the ranch's problems alone. It would be the safe choice, the one that didn't risk reopening old wounds or confronting painful memories, or he could go home. The thought terrified him more than any wild bronco ever had. Going home meant facing the place where Sarah had lived and died, walking through rooms that held memories of their lost love, confronting his own failures as a man and a brother. It meant looking James in the eye and somehow finding a way to help rebuild what Cole had walked away from in his pride and fear. As the sun reached its zenith, Cole made his way to the small cabin he'd built on the edge of his property. The structure was simple but well-crafted, with a stone fireplace and large windows that looked out over the corrals and the mountains beyond. He'd designed it for solitude, a place where he could retreat from the world and its complications. Inside, he pulled out a wooden box from beneath his bed, hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. The contents were few but precious. Letters from his mother before her death 5 years ago. A photograph of his family taken when James graduated from the Territorial College, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, the engagement ring Sarah had returned to him. Cole lifted the ring to the light, studying the small diamond that had taken him 6 months of saved wages to afford. He'd planned to give it to her beside the river where they'd shared their first kiss, but nerves had gotten the better of him, and he'd ended up proposing awkwardly on the front porch of her father's house. She'd laughed at his nervousness and said yes anyway, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him with a passion that had made him believe, for a moment, that he truly deserved such happiness. The weight of regret settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Sarah was gone, buried in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery beside Cole's mother and the other souls who'd found their rest in Montana soil. All his years of self-imposed exile, all his careful avoidance of home, had been for nothing. He'd lost the chance to make amends, to tell her he was sorry, to explain that his coldness had been born of fear rather than indifference. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Cole quickly returned the ring to its box and called out for whoever it was to enter. To his surprise, Father Miguel Santos stepped inside, the Catholic priest who served the small but devoted congregation in Copper Falls. Miguel was a young man, only a few years older than Cole, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had won him respect even among the Protestant families in the area. "Cole, my friend," Miguel said, removing his hat and looking around the spare cabin. "Tom Bradley told me about your family troubles. I wanted to offer my condolences and see if there was anything I could do to help." Cole gestured for the priest to sit in one of the 2 chairs by the fireplace. "That's kind of you, Father, but I'm not sure there's much anyone can do." Miguel settled into the chair, his dark robes rustling softly. He was originally from California, the son of Mexican immigrants who'd raised him to see service to others as the highest calling. His assignment to the Montana Territory had been intended as a temporary posting, but he'd fallen in love with the rugged landscape and the resilient people who called it home. "Tom mentioned that you're uncertain about returning home," Miguel said gently. "Would it help to talk about what's troubling you?" Cole had never been one for confession or spiritual guidance, but something about Miguel's presence invited honesty. Perhaps it was the priest's youth, or the fact that he'd come to the frontier by choice rather than necessity, understanding something about the pull of wide-open spaces and the desire to start fresh. "The woman who died," Cole said slowly, "she was supposed to be my wife once. I let her go, let my brother marry her instead, because I was too proud and too scared to fight for what I wanted." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "And now you're afraid to face the consequences of that choice." "I'm afraid of a lot of things," Cole admitted. "Afraid of seeing the life they built together. Afraid of looking my brother in the eye, knowing I abandoned him when he needed help with the ranch. Afraid of standing beside her grave and having to accept that I'll never get the chance to make things right." "Forgiveness is a difficult concept," Miguel said. "We often find it easier to forgive others than to forgive ourselves." Cole stood and moved to the window, looking out at the corrals where his horses stood peacefully in the afternoon sun. "She deserved better than what I gave her. James could offer her the kind of love I was too damaged to provide." "Perhaps," Miguel said. "But running away from your family, from your responsibilities, that's not the kind of man she would have wanted you to be either." The words hit Cole like a physical blow because he knew they were true. Sarah had always seen potential in him that he couldn't see in himself. She'd believed he was capable of great love, great loyalty, great courage. Instead, he'd shown her none of those things when it mattered most. "My father is dying," Cole said. "James is trying to hold the ranch. Together alone, probably drowning in debt and responsibilities. I should have been there all along, but you can be there now." Cole turned from the window to meet Miguel's steady gaze. "What if it's too late? What if James resents me for staying away? What if going back just makes everything worse?" "What if it doesn't?" Miguel countered. "What if your brother needs you more than he's able to say in a telegram? What if your father is waiting to see his eldest son one more time before he passes? What if there are things that need to be said and forgiveness that needs to be offered on both sides?" The priest had a point, but Cole's fear ran deeper than simple embarrassment or awkwardness. He'd built his entire adult life around the belief that he was better off alone, that his presence in other people's lives caused more harm than good. Returning home would force him to confront that fundamental assumption about himself. "I work with wild horses," Cole said, attempting to change the subject. "Animals that have been hurt or abandoned, that don't trust easily. Sometimes I think I understand them because I'm not so different," Miguel smiled gently. "And what do you do with these wild horses? Do you leave them alone in their fear and mistrust?" "No, I help them heal. I show them that not all humans will hurt them." "And how do you do that?" Cole considered the question, thinking of the paint mare and dozens of others he'd worked with over the years. "Patience, mostly. Consistency. Showing up every day even when they reject my help. Proving through actions that they can trust again." "Perhaps," Miguel suggested, "your family needs the same kind of healing that you give to those horses." The comparison was uncomfortable but accurate. Cole had always found it easier to extend compassion to animals than to people, but the principles were the same. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent kindness and genuine care. The wild horses in his corrals had all been damaged by human cruelty or neglect, but they could learn to trust again when treated with patience and respect. James wrote that the ranch is failing, Cole said. Even if I go back, I might not be able to save it. Success isn't always measured by the outcome, Miguel replied. Sometimes it's measured by the attempt, by showing up when you're needed, even when it's difficult. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, Cole wrestling with a decision that felt larger than simply returning home. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. All these years, he'd told himself that staying away was a kindness to his family, that his absence was better than his flawed presence. But maybe he'd been wrong about that too. Finally, Miguel rose from his chair and placed a gentle hand on Cole's shoulder. I'll be praying for you and your family, whatever you decide. But remember, God rarely calls us to the easy path. Usually, he calls us to the one that requires the most courage. After the priest left, Cole returned to working with his horses, but his mind remained unsettled. The paint mare had made remarkable progress, allowing him to brush her coat and pick up her hooves without panic. She still startled at sudden movements and kept one ear constantly turned toward potential escape routes, but her basic trust in him was growing stronger each day. As evening approached, Cole found himself thinking about Sarah, really thinking about her for the first time in years, rather than just carrying the abstract weight of loss and regret. He remembered her laughter, the way she hummed while helping, her mother with household chores, her fierce protectiveness of anyone she perceived as being treated unfairly. She'd had strong opinions about politics, literature, and social justice, but she'd never tried to force her views on others, preferring to lead by example. Most of all, he remembered her capacity for forgiveness. She'd never held grudges, never let the sun set on anger, always believed that people could change and grow if given the chance. If she were alive today, she would probably be encouraging him to go home, to mend the relationships he'd damaged through pride and fear. The thought of Sarah's forgiveness led him to wonder about James. His younger brother had always been the more optimistic of the two, quick to see the best in people and situations. Even after Cole had left, even after years of silence and minimal contact, James had continued to send letters to include Cole in family news, to leave the door open for reconciliation. The telegram itself was evidence of James's generous spirit. Despite everything, despite the years of absence and the burden of caring for their father alone, James was reaching out in his time of greatest need. He could have hired help, could have sold the ranch, could have handled their father's death, without involving the brother who'd abandoned them. Instead, he'd swallowed his pride and asked for help. Cole realized that his own pride had become a prison, keeping him isolated and alone while his family struggled without him. The wild horses he worked with had to overcome their fear and learn to trust again in order to find peace and purpose. Perhaps it was time for him to do the same. The train to Cedar Ridge departed at dawn on Thursday, its black smoke cutting across the pale morning sky like a scar. Cole Matheson sat in the passenger car with his leather satchel and a heavy heart, watching the familiar landscape of Copper Falls disappear behind him. He'd left his horses in the capable hands of Tom Bradley's ranch crew, though parting with the paint mare had proven more difficult than expected. She'd pressed against the corral fence as he'd loaded his belongings, her dark eyes following his every movement with an intelligence that seemed to understand his departure. The journey south took him, through terrain that grew increasingly familiar. As the hours passed, rolling hills gave way to broader valleys, and the pine forests thinned to reveal the kind of open grassland where cattle could graze and wild horses could run free. Cole found himself studying every ridge and creek, remembering childhood rides with his father, and the countless hours he'd spent learning to read the land like a favorite book. The train made several stops along the way, picking up passengers and cargo bound for the growing settlements scattered across the territory. At each station, Cole observed the bustle of frontier commerce with detached interest, noting how the towns had expanded since he'd last traveled this route. New businesses, more houses, the inevitable signs of progress creeping across the wilderness. Like morning frost, it was at the second stop in the town of Millerville that she boarded. Cole noticed her immediately, though he tried not to stare. She moved with the kind of confident grace that suggested someone accustomed to taking care of herself. Her traveling dress practical rather than fashionable. Her auburn hair pinned back in a style that was both elegant and sensible. She carried a worn leather medical bag and a small carpet bag. And when the conductor offered to help her find a seat, she thanked him politely but firmly declined any assistance with her luggage. She chose a seat 3 rows ahead of Cole, settling by the window with the practiced efficiency of someone who traveled frequently. As the train resumed its journey, Cole found his attention drifting from the passing landscape to the graceful curve of her neck, the way she occasionally consulted a small notebook, the confident manner in which she handled the minor discomforts of rail travel. When the conductor came through checking tickets, Cole caught a glimpse of her profile as she turned to speak with him. The sight hit him like a physical blow. She bore a striking resemblance to Sarah, though the similarities were subtle rather than obvious. It was something in the set of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when listening, the auburn tint to her hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Cole forced himself to look away, focusing instead on the telegram in his pocket and the difficult reunion that awaited him. The last thing he needed was to become distracted by a stranger who reminded him of his lost love. But despite his best efforts, his gaze kept returning to her, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The train encountered delays at the next station, mechanical problems that would require several hours to repair. The passengers were informed they could stretch their legs in the town, perhaps take a meal at the local hotel, while the railroad crew worked on the locomotive. Cole gathered his belongings reluctantly, hoping to avoid any interaction with fellow travelers, but fate seemed determined to frustrate his plans for solitude. As he stepped down from the train car, he nearly collided with the auburn-haired woman who was consulting her notebook while walking. Cole reached out instinctively to steady her, his hands briefly touching her shoulders before she regained her balance. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, looking up at him with eyes the color of winter storms. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "No harm done, miss," Cole replied, tipping his hat. Up close, her resemblance to Sarah was less pronounced, but somehow more intriguing. She had a stronger jaw, more determined eyes, and a small scar just above her left eyebrow that spoke of some past adventure or mishap. "Dr. Victoria Sinclair," she said, extending her hand with the forthright manner of someone accustomed to introducing herself professionally. "And you are?" "Cole Matheson," he replied, accepting her handshake and noting the firm strength of her grip. "Doctor?" "Physician," she confirmed. "I studied at the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia before returning west to practice." "Are you traveling far, Mr. Matheson?" "Cedar Ridge," Cole said. "Family business." Something in his tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because her expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry if it's difficult news that brings you home." Cole found himself studying her face, searching for clues about the woman behind the professional demeanor. She was probably close to his own age, with laugh lines around her eyes that suggested someone who found joy in life despite its hardships. Her hands, he noticed, bore the telltale signs of someone who worked with them, small scars and calluses that spoke of practical skills beyond book learning. "Are you establishing a practice in Cedar Ridge?" he asked, surprising himself with his curiosity. Dr. Sinclair smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Actually, I'm already established there. I took over Dr. Whitmore's practice." When he passed away last year, I assume you knew him? The mention of Sarah's father hit Cole like an unexpected blow. Marcus Whitmore had been a good man, dedicated to his patients and deeply devoted to his family. His death meant that Sarah had lost both parents before her own passing, leaving her even more isolated in her final months. I knew him, Cole said carefully. Good man. I'm sure his patients were sorry to lose him. They were, Dr. Sinclair. Agreed. But they've been very welcoming to me, despite some initial skepticism about having a woman physician. Dr. Whitmore's daughter, Sarah, actually helped smooth the transition before she. Victoria paused, studying Cole's face with the keen observation skills of someone trained to read symptoms and signs. You knew her too. It wasn't a question. Cole nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. Dr. Sinclair didn't press for details, but her expression conveyed a depth of understanding that suggested she'd learned something about loss herself. She was a remarkable woman, Victoria said simply. She helped establish the Valley's first real school, taught reading to anyone who wanted to learn, and spent countless hours helping me organize Dr. Whitmore's medical records when I took over the practice. Her death was a tremendous loss for the entire community. Cole felt a surge of pride mixed with renewed grief. Of course, Sarah had been involved in education and community service. She'd always believed in using her gifts to help others, whether that meant teaching children to read or helping a new doctor feel welcome in an unfamiliar place. The hotel here serves decent food, Victoria said, perhaps sensing his need for a change of subject. Would you care to join me for dinner while we wait for the train repairs? I promise not to pry into your personal business, but I find traveling companions make the journey more pleasant. Cole's first instinct was to decline. He'd spent 3 years avoiding unnecessary social interaction, particularly with women who might complicate his carefully ordered existence. But something about Dr. Sinclair's straightforward manner and genuine kindness made refusal seem churlish. I'd be honored, he said, offering his arm. The hotel dining room was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and windows that looked out over the town's main street. Victoria proved to be an engaging dinner companion, sharing stories about her medical training and the challenges of establishing a practice on the frontier without once making Cole feel pressured to reciprocate with personal details. The biggest challenge, she said over bowls of beef stew, isn't the medical work itself, but convincing people that women can be just as competent as men in matters of science and healing. I've had patients refuse treatment simply because of my gender, even when they desperately needed help. That must be frustrating, Cole said. It is, but I've learned that actions speak louder than arguments. When I successfully deliver a difficult birth or treat a serious injury, word spreads. Slowly but surely, attitudes begin to change. Cole found himself admiring her determination and practical approach to prejudice. It reminded him of Sarah's quiet persistence in pursuing her educational goals, despite skeptics who believed women had no business with books and learning. What brought you back west? He asked. Philadelphia must have offered more opportunities. Victoria's smile faded slightly, and Cole caught a glimpse of something deeper behind her composed exterior. My father was a frontier doctor in Colorado before his death. I grew up believing that medicine should serve those who need it most, not just those who can afford the finest physicians. The frontier communities are where that philosophy can make the greatest difference. And your family supported this decision? My family, Victoria said with a slight laugh that held no humor, consists entirely of myself at this point, which makes career decisions considerably simpler, if lonelier. Cole recognized the carefully casual tone of someone who'd learned to speak of loss without revealing too much pain. He wondered what tragedy had left Dr. Sinclair alone in the world, but he respected her privacy too much to ask directly. I work with horses, he found himself saying. Wild Mustangs mostly, animals that have been hurt or abandoned. "That's interesting work," Victoria said, and her interest seemed genuine rather than polite. "I imagine it requires considerable patience." "It does. Most people try to break a wild horse through force, but that usually just creates more problems. I've found that trust works better than dominance." "Sound medical philosophy as well," Victoria observed. "Patients respond better to treatment when they trust their physician." As the evening progressed, Cole discovered that conversation with Dr. Sinclair came surprisingly easily. She possessed the rare gift of being genuinely interested in other people without being intrusive, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was listening rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. When she laughed at his description of a particularly stubborn bronco, the sound was rich and genuine, free of the artificial charm that some women cultivated. "You mentioned that you're returning home for family business," Victoria said as they finished their meal. "I hope it's not too serious." Cole hesitated, then found himself telling her about his father's illness and the failing ranch, though he carefully omitted the more painful details about Sarah and his long estrangement from James. Victoria listened without interruption, her storm-gray eyes reflecting genuine sympathy. "Loss is never easy," she said when he finished. "But sometimes returning home, even under difficult circumstances, can offer opportunities for healing that we didn't expect. You sound like you speak from experience." "I do," Victoria admitted. "I lost my father 5 years ago, and I spent too long avoiding the places and memories that reminded me of him. When I finally returned to frontier medicine, I discovered that honoring his memory through my work brought more comfort than avoidance ever had." The conductor's whistle interrupted their conversation, signaling that the train repairs were complete. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to reboard, Cole found himself reluctant to end the evening. Victoria Sinclair was unlike any woman he'd met since leaving home, combining intelligence, compassion, and inner strength in a way that both attracted and intimidated him. "Thank you for the pleasant company," he said as they walked back toward the train. "The journey would have been considerably more tedious without it." "The pleasure was mutual," Victoria replied. "Perhaps we'll meet again in Cedar Ridge. It's not such a large community that our paths won't cross." As they settled back into their seats for the final portion of the journey, Cole found his thoughts divided between anticipation of seeing his family and curiosity about the remarkable woman sitting 3 rows ahead. He'd spent years convincing himself that he was better off alone, that emotional attachments only led to pain and disappointment. But Victoria Sinclair had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten: the simple pleasure of connecting with another human being who shared his values and understood his perspective. The train pulled into Cedar Ridge just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Cole of childhood evenings spent watching the light fade over the family ranch. The station was smaller than he remembered, but the town beyond had clearly grown during his absence. New buildings lined the main street, and the sound of hammering suggested construction projects still in progress. Victoria gathered her medical bag and carpet bag efficiently, nodding goodbye to Cole with a smile that seemed to hold promise of future encounters. He watched her step onto the platform and stride confidently toward the town, her bearing that of someone who belonged wherever she chose to make her home. Cole took his time collecting his own belongings, suddenly nervous about the reunion that awaited him. James had written that he would meet the train, but 3 years of separation hung between them like an unspoken question. Would his brother welcome him home, or merely tolerate his presence out of desperate necessity? The platform was nearly empty by the time Cole finally stepped down from the train car. The familiar scent of pine and prairie grass filled his lungs, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. This was home, for better or worse, the place where he'd learned to love and learn to lose, where his mistakes had shaped him into the man he'd become. "Cole?" He turned at the sound of his name, spoken in a voice that was familiar yet changed. James Matheson stood beside a wagon at the edge of the platform, and Cole was shocked by how much his younger brother had aged in their years apart. James was thinner than Cole remembered, his golden hair now touched with premature gray, his face marked by the kind of deep lines that came from constant worry and hard work, but his smile was unchanged, warm and genuine despite the circumstances that had brought them together. James stepped forward and embraced Cole without hesitation, the kind of wholehearted welcome that made Cole's throat tight with emotion. "Thank God you came," James said, his voice rough with feeling. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm sorry it took this long," Cole replied, meaning more than just the journey from Copper Falls. James pulled back to study his older brother's face, and Cole saw forgiveness there instead of the resentment he'd feared. "You're here now. That's what matters." As they loaded Cole's belongings into the wagon, James filled him in on their father's condition and the ranch's struggles. Jeremiah Matheson was bedridden but alert, determined to hold on long enough to see his eldest son again. The ranch was, indeed, in financial trouble, hit hard by a series of harsh winters and falling cattle prices that had devastated many of the valley's operations. "I've tried to keep things together," James said as they drove through the darkening countryside. "But I'm not you, Cole. I don't have your gift with the horses, and I've made some poor decisions about which contracts to accept. We'll figure it out together," Cole said, surprised by how easily the words came. For years he'd avoided any situation that required him to commit to helping others, but sitting beside his brother under the vast Montana sky, the promise felt natural and right. The ranch house appeared ahead of them, lamplight glowing in the windows like a beacon of welcome. Cole's heart clenched at the sight of the home he'd abandoned, the place where his parents had built their dreams and raised their children. It looked smaller than he remembered, but no less beloved. "Sarah's buried in the family plot behind the house," James said quietly as they approached. "I thought you should know before we go inside." Cole nodded, grateful for the warning. The knowledge that Sarah's final resting place was so close to the house where she'd lived as James's wife added another layer of complexity to his return home. "She asked about you," James continued, his voice barely audible above the wagon wheels. "Near the end, when the consumption was taking her strength, she wanted to know if you were happy in Copper Falls. What did you tell her?" "I told her you were doing good work with the horses, that you'd found your place in the world. I didn't tell her that I thought you were probably as lonely as I was without you here." The simple honesty of James's words hit Cole harder than any accusation could have. His brother had always possessed an emotional intelligence that Cole envied, an ability to see past surface behaviors to the pain beneath. As they pulled up to the house, Cole steeled himself for the reunion with his dying father and the beginning of whatever came next. He'd spent 3 years running from his past, but now he was home, ready to face the consequences of his choices and hopefully find a way to make amends. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who'd worked for the family since Cole was a teenager. Her face lit up at the sight of him, and she enveloped him in a fierce hug that smelled of baking bread and lavender soap. "About time you came home," she scolded, though her eyes were bright with tears. "Your father's been asking for you every day." Cole followed James through the familiar rooms of his childhood, noting how little had changed despite the years. The same furniture, the same photographs on the mantel, the same sense of warmth and belonging that had made this house a true home. Only now there were touches that spoke of Sarah's presence. A quilt she'd stitched draped over the sofa, books she'd collected arranged on new shelves, small decorative items that reflected her taste and personality. At the top of the stairs, James paused outside their father's bedroom door. "He's weaker than I wrote," he warned, "but his mind is still sharp. Don't be shocked by how he looks." Cole nodded and followed his brother into the room where Jeremiah Matheson lay propped up against pillows, his once powerful frame reduced by illness, but his eyes still bright with intelligence and love. When he saw Cole, the old man's face broke into a smile that erased years of separation and regret. "My boy," Jeremiah whispered, extending a trembling hand. "You came home." Cole knelt beside the bed and took his father's hand, feeling how fragile the bones had become beneath paper-thin skin. "I'm sorry it took so long, Pa." "You're here now," Jeremiah said, echoing James's earlier words. "That's all that matters." As Cole settled into the chair beside his father's bed, listening to stories about the ranch and the valley's changes, he felt something shift inside him. The fear that had kept him away for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He was home, surrounded by people who loved him despite his failures, ready to help rebuild what his pride had nearly destroyed. Outside the bedroom window, the Montana night settled over the ranch like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in the distance, wild horses ran free across the prairie, their hoofbeats echoing like heartbeats in the darkness. Cole listened to the sound and thought of Victoria Sinclair, already established in her new life, just a few miles away in Cedar Ridge. Tomorrow would bring challenges and difficult conversations, the hard work of rebuilding trust and saving the ranch. But tonight, Cole Matheson was home, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt like exactly where he belonged. Dawn arrived, with the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle, familiar melodies that pulled Cole from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in months. He woke in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by walls that held memories of a simpler time when the future had seemed full of endless possibilities. The quilt covering him was one his mother had made, its pattern of interlocking rings faded but still beautiful after all these years. Cole dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, finding Mrs. Henderson already busy in the kitchen, her gray hair pinned back as she worked over the cast-iron stove. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air, along with the rich aroma of coffee that could wake the dead. "Sit yourself down," she commanded without turning around. "You're too thin, and I won't have people saying I don't feed the men in this house properly." Cole smiled at her unchanging nature and settled at the kitchen table where he'd eaten countless meals as a boy. Through the window, he could see the barn and corrals where his father had taught him to work with horses, the skills that had shaped his entire adult life. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, but no less important. James appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day's work despite the early hour. His face bore the permanent lines of someone who carried too much responsibility, but his greeting was warm and genuine. "Pa's asking for you," James said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Henderson. "He had a good night, better than he's had in weeks. I think your being here has given him new strength." Cole nodded and headed upstairs, finding his father awake and alert, propped up against pillows with a stack of ranch ledgers beside him on the bed. Jeremiah Matheson had always been a hands-on manager, someone who knew every detail of his operation, down to the last penny spent and earned. "Cole," his father said, gesturing to the ledgers, "I want you to understand what you're walking into here. The ranch isn't just struggling, it's in real trouble." For the next hour, Jeremiah walked Cole through the financial situation with the methodical thoroughness of a man who'd spent his life making careful decisions about land and livestock. The numbers told a stark story of mounting debts, failed investments, and a series of harsh winters that had decimated their cattle herds. "The bank's been patient," Jeremiah explained, "but Samuel Morrison isn't a charitable man. He's given us until the end of harvest season to catch up on the mortgage payments, or he'll foreclose." Cole studied the figures, his mind automatically calculating what it would take to turn things around. The math was sobering but not impossible, provided they could find ways to increase revenue while cutting expenses. "What about the horse program?" Cole asked. "You always said the Mustang training brought in good money." Jeremiah's expression darkened. "That's part of the problem. After you left, I tried to continue the work myself, but I don't have your gift. We lost 3 good horses to injuries, and word got around that Broken Arrow Ranch wasn't reliable anymore. The contracts dried up. The guilt hit Cole like a physical blow. By abandoning his family, he'd not only left them emotionally, but had also destroyed one of their most profitable enterprises. His specialized skills had been crucial to the ranch's success, and his absence had created a hole that James couldn't fill. "I can rebuild the program," Cole said with more confidence than he felt. "It'll take time to restore our reputation, but the demand for trained Mustangs is still there." "That's what I'm counting on," Jeremiah replied. "But there's something else you need to know. Morrison isn't just interested in foreclosing for the money. He's been buying up distressed properties all over the valley, consolidating them into larger operations. He sees our ranch as a key piece in his empire." Cole frowned. Samuel Morrison had been a minor player in valley politics when Cole left. Owning a small bank and a few business interests in Cedar Ridge, the idea that he'd grown powerful enough to threaten established ranchers like the Mathesons was troubling. "How many families has he forced out?" 6 in the past 2 years, Jeremiah said grimly. The Carlsons, the Weatherbys, the Patterson family that had spread up north of Willow Creek. All of them lost their land when they couldn't meet Morrison's terms. The conversation was interrupted by James calling from downstairs. Cole kissed his father's forehead and promised to return later to discuss strategy. Downstairs, he found James waiting with 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "There's someone here to see you," James said. "Dr. Sinclair. She's waiting on the front porch." Cole felt his pulse quicken at the mention of Victoria's name. He hadn't expected to see her so soon after their train encounter, and he wondered what had brought her to the ranch this early in the morning. He found Victoria sitting on the porch swing, her medical bag at her feet and her hair catching the morning sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and she smiled when she saw him approach. "Good morning, Mr. Matheson," she said, rising from the swing. "I hope you don't mind the early visit. I wanted to check on your father and see how you're settling in." "Of course," Cole replied, gesturing for her to sit back down. "I appreciate you taking the time." "It's not just professional courtesy," Victoria admitted. "Your father has been one of my most cooperative patients since I took over Dr. Whitmore's practice. He's also been very worried about you." Cole settled into the chair across from her, noting how natural she looked in the ranch setting. Many city-educated women seemed out of place on the frontier, but Victoria possessed an adaptability that suggested she could make herself at home anywhere. "He told you about me?" "He mentioned that his eldest son had gone north to work with horses," Victoria said carefully. "He was very proud of your reputation as a trainer, but I could tell he missed you terribly." The simple statement carried more weight than any accusation could have. Cole had spent 3 years telling himself that his family was better off without him, but Victoria's observation suggested that his absence had caused more pain than his presence would have. "May I ask you something personal?" Victoria continued, her tone gentle but direct. Cole nodded, though he braced himself for questions he might not be ready to answer. "Your brother James mentioned that you left after some kind of family disagreement. I'm not asking for details, but I am curious about what made you decide to come back now." Cole considered how much to reveal, studying Victoria's face for signs of mere curiosity versus genuine concern. What he saw there was the compassionate interest of someone who understood that families were complicated and that healing sometimes required difficult conversations. "I made mistakes," he said finally. "Pride and fear made me run away when I should have stayed and worked things out. Coming back feels like the first right decision I've made in years." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "In my medical training, I learned that healing often requires reopening wounds that haven't closed properly. It's painful but necessary. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Sinclair?" "It's my personal observation, Mr. Matheson. I've done My share of running away from difficult situations. Before Cole could ask what she meant, James appeared in the doorway with Mrs. Henderson behind him. The housekeeper carried a tray with fresh coffee and biscuits, her face beaming with the pleasure of having a guest to fuss over. "Dr. Sinclair," James said warmly, "it's good to see you again. How's the practice treating you?" "Very well, thank you," Victoria replied, accepting the cup of coffee. "I wanted to examine your father this morning and check on his medication. The laudanum Dr. Whitmore prescribed was helping with his pain, but I have some concerns about the dosage." As Victoria headed upstairs to see Jeremiah, Cole found himself watching her go with an appreciation that went beyond mere physical attraction. There was something compelling about her combination of professional competence and personal warmth, the way she moved through the world with purpose and confidence. "She's remarkable," James said quietly, settling beside Cole on the porch. "Sarah thought very highly of her." The mention of Sarah's name created a moment of awkward silence. Cole knew that eventually he and James would need to discuss what had happened between the three of them, but he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. "James," Cole said instead, "tell me about Samuel Morrison. Pa says he's been forcing families off their land." James's expression hardened. "Morrison's become a problem for everyone in the valley. He loans money at reasonable rates initially, but then he finds ways to call in the debts early or change the terms. When people can't pay, he forecloses and adds their property to his holdings. That sounds illegal." "It might be, but Morrison owns the bank and has connections with the territorial government. Who's going to challenge him? Most of the families he's targeted were already struggling financially." Cole absorbed this information, understanding that their family's troubles were part of a larger pattern of economic manipulation. Morrison wasn't just a banker looking to collect debts. He was systematically acquiring the valley's best ranch land through predatory lending practices. What about the other ranchers? Are they organizing any kind of resistance? "Some talk, but no real action," James admitted. "Everyone's too focused on their own survival to mount a coordinated response. And Morrison's been clever about timing his moves when families are most vulnerable." Victoria emerged from the house 20 minutes later, her expression serious, but not alarmed. She settled back onto the porch swing and addressed both brothers. "Your father's condition is stable, but he's weaker than I'd like to see. The important thing now is keeping him comfortable and allowing him to conserve his strength for the things that matter most to him." "How long?" Cole asked, though he dreaded the answer. "It's difficult to say with certainty," Victoria replied. "Weeks rather than months, but he could surprise us. Sometimes the will to live can extend a person's time far beyond what medical science would predict." Cole nodded, grateful for her honesty. His father had always been a fighter, and knowing that Cole was home might indeed give him the motivation to hold on longer than expected. "I've adjusted his medication slightly," Victoria continued, "and I'd like to check on him again in a few days. In the meantime, if his condition changes in any way, don't hesitate to send for me immediately." As Victoria prepared to leave, Cole found himself reluctant to see her go. Their brief interactions had reminded him of how much he missed intelligent conversation and genuine human connection. "Dr. Sinclair," he said impulsively, "would you be interested in seeing the ranch? I mean, properly seeing it. James and I will be working to restore the horse training program, and you might find it interesting." Victoria paused in gathering her medical bag, her eyes meeting his with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I would like that very much," she said. "Perhaps this weekend, if that's convenient." After Victoria left, Cole and James spent the morning touring the ranch and assessing what needed to be done. The buildings were in reasonably good repair, but the corrals needed significant work, and several pieces of equipment required replacement or major maintenance. The hay fields looked healthy, but the cattle herd was smaller than Cole remembered, evidence of the hard winters and financial struggles James had described. "The good news," James said as they examined the main corral, "is that the foundation is still solid. We have good water rights, prime grazing land, and buildings that just need some attention. What we're lacking is capital and time." Cole studied the corral where he'd trained his first Mustang as a teenager, remembering the pride he'd felt when his father had praised his work. The skills were still there, refined by 3 years of working with difficult horses in Copper Falls. But rebuilding their reputation would require patience and successful results. "What if we started small?" Cole suggested. "Take on 1 or 2 horses, do the work for free to prove we're back in business. Word will spread if we're successful. Morrison's not going to give us time for a gradual rebuild," James pointed out. "We need significant income by harvest time, or we lose everything." Cole nodded, understanding the pressure they faced. Traditional horse training took months, and they needed results in weeks. It would require taking risks, working with more dangerous animals, and pushing themselves harder than was probably wise. "There might be another option," James said hesitantly, "but you're not going to like it." "What option?" "Morrison himself has a string of Mustangs he once trained. Wild horses he acquired when he foreclosed on the Patterson Ranch. He's been looking for someone to handle them, and the pay would solve our immediate problems." Cole felt his jaw tighten. The idea of working for the man who was systematically destroying their neighbors was repugnant, but he could see the logic in James's suggestion. If they could earn enough from Morrison's commission to save the ranch, they could use their stability to help other families resist his predatory practices. How many horses? 8 Mustangs, all unbroken, plus a stallion that's been giving him particular trouble. He's willing to pay premium rates because no one else wants to take on the work. Cole considered the proposal, weighing his principles against his family's survival. Sometimes he realized the right choice wasn't the most satisfying one. "Set up a meeting," he said finally. "I'll at least look at the horses." That afternoon, Cole rode out alone to the family cemetery behind the house, a small plot surrounded by a white picket fence where 3 generations of Mathesons rested beneath the Montana sky. His mother's grave was marked by a simple granite stone, and beside it, a newer marker bore Sarah's name and the dates of her brief life. Cole stood before Sarah's grave for a long time, finally allowing himself to fully confront the loss he'd been avoiding for months. She'd been buried while he was training horses hundreds of miles away, unaware that the woman he'd loved was fighting a losing battle with consumption. The guilt of not being there, of not having the chance to apologize or find closure, settled on him like a physical weight. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, his voice barely audible in the prairie wind. "I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved, and I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of cattle. Cole imagined he could hear Sarah's voice in the whisper of air through the fence posts, offering the forgiveness he'd never had the courage to ask for while she was alive. When he returned to the house, he found Victoria's buggy in the yard again. This time she wasn't alone. A young woman sat beside her, dark-haired and nervous-looking, clutching a bundle wrapped in blankets. "Mr. Matheson," Victoria called as he approached. "This is Miss Elena Rodriguez. She needs our help." Cole tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the buggy, noting the fear in the young woman's eyes and the protective way Victoria sat beside her. "What kind of help?" Victoria's expression was grim. "Elena works for Samuel Morrison as a housekeeper. She discovered something that puts her in considerable danger." Elena looked up at Cole with desperate eyes, her English accented but clear. "Senator Morrison, he is not just taking the ranches. He is bringing in men, bad men, to force families to sell. I heard him planning to burn out the Hendersons next week." Cole felt ice form in his stomach. The Hendersons owned a small ranch northwest of town, a family operation run by an elderly couple and their adult son. If Morrison was escalating from financial manipulation to outright violence, no one in the valley was safe. "Why come to us?" Cole asked, though he was already formulating plans. "Dr. Sinclair, she helped my little brother when he was sick," Elena explained. "She said if I ever needed help, I could trust her." I did not know where else to go. Victoria met Cole's eyes with a look that asked a clear question. Would he help, or would he stay focused on his own family's problems? The choice felt like a test of the man he wanted to be versus the man he'd been for the past 3 years. "You'll stay here tonight," Cole decided. "Mrs. Henderson will make up a room for you. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to use what you know to protect the Hendersons and stop Morrison." Elena's relief was palpable, and Victoria's smile told Cole he'd made the right choice. As the three of them walked toward the house, Cole realized that coming home hadn't just meant reuniting with his family. It had meant accepting responsibility for his community and taking stands that went beyond his own immediate interests. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner with Elena as their guest, Cole felt something shift in his understanding of what home truly meant. It wasn't just the land or the buildings or even the family connections. It was the network of relationships and obligations that tied people together, the willingness to help neighbors and strangers alike when circumstances demanded it. Victoria had stayed for dinner at Mrs. Henderson's insistence, and Cole found himself watching her interact with Elena, offering comfort and practical advice with the skill of someone who'd learned to help people in crisis. Her presence at their table felt natural and right, as if she belonged among them. After the meal, as Victoria prepared to return to town, Cole walked her to her buggy under a sky brilliant with stars. "Thank you for bringing Elena to us," he said. "That took courage." "She took real courage," Victoria replied. "I just provided transportation." "Still, you could have stayed out of it. Morrison's a powerful man, and helping his enemies won't make your life easier." Victoria looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, her expression serious. "I've learned that staying neutral in the face of injustice is just another form of complicity. Sometimes we have to choose sides." As her buggy disappeared down the road toward town, Cole stood in the ranch yard listening to the night sounds of home. Owls calling from the barn, horses moving restlessly in the corrals, the distant howl of coyotes on the prairie. For the first time since reading James's telegram, he felt truly committed to staying and fighting for what mattered. The Mustangs he'd trained in Copper Falls had taught him patience and persistence, but Victoria Sinclair was teaching him something else entirely. She was showing him what it meant to be brave, not just in facing wild animals, but in facing the complexities of human relationships and community. Responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring the meeting with Morrison and the beginning of what promised to be a dangerous game. But tonight, Cole Matheson was home, surrounded by people who needed him and ready to prove that some things were worth fighting for. The meeting with Samuel Morrison took place at his office above the Cedar Ridge Bank, a spacious room decorated with expensive furniture that seemed designed to intimidate visitors. Morrison himself was a man in his 50s, well-dressed and soft around the middle, with pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed. He greeted Cole and James with the kind of cordial smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Matheson," Morrison said, rising from behind his mahogany desk, "I was sorry to hear about your father's condition. Jeremeier's been a pillar of this community for many years." Cole accepted the handshake while studying Morrison's face, looking for signs of the ruthless manipulator Elena had described. What he saw was a man who'd learned to wear respectability like a well-tailored coat, hiding his true nature beneath layers of social convention. "I understand you have some horses that need training," Cole said, cutting through the pleasantries. Morrison's smile widened. Direct. "I like that in a man. Yes, I've acquired a string of Mustangs that require specialized attention. 8 mares and a stallion, all wild-caught and stubborn as mules. previous trainers have refused to work with them. Why? The stallion, primarily. Magnificent animal, but dangerous. He's already injured 2 men who tried to break him using conventional methods. Morrison moved to the window overlooking Main Street, his hands clasped behind his back. I'm told you have unconventional methods. Cole nodded. I might. But I'll need to see the horses first. Assess their condition and temperament before I agree to anything. Of course. And my terms are generous. $500 for the complete. String, trained to saddle and suitable for ranch work. Half paid up front. The amount was substantial, more than enough to solve the Matheson family's immediate financial crisis. Cole understood why Morrison was willing to pay such a premium. He needed those horses trained quickly for some purpose. That probably wasn't entirely legitimate. When can I see them? Cole asked. Tomorrow morning. I have them penned at a facility outside town. Morrison returned to his desk, withdrawing a contract from a drawer. Naturally, I'll require your signature. On an agreement. Standard terms with one addition, absolute discretion about my business affairs. Cole accepted the contract but didn't sign it. I'll review this tonight and give you my answer tomorrow. Morrison's eyes hardened slightly. I hope you understand, Mr. Matheson, that opportunities like this don't come along often in a community this size. It would be unfortunate if pride interfered with practical necessity. The veiled threat was clear, but Cole maintained his composure. I'll be in touch. Outside the bank, James was quiet until they were well away from any potential eavesdroppers. That man makes my skin crawl, he said finally. But the money would save the ranch. It would, Cole agreed. The question is whether we can afford to take it. They rode home through the afternoon heat, both men lost in their own thoughts. Cole found himself thinking about Elena's warnings and Morrison's barely concealed threats. Working with the bankers. Horses would provide the funds they desperately needed, but it would also put them in Morrison's debt and potentially compromise their ability to help their neighbors out at the ranch. They found Victoria's buggy in the yard again. This time, she was sitting on the front porch with Elena. Both women engaged in animated conversation with Mrs. Henderson. Cole noticed that. Elena looked more relaxed than she had the previous day, her fear replaced by something that might have been hope. Gentlemen, Victoria called as they approached. How did your meeting go? Educational, Cole replied, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. What brings you back so soon, Dr. Sinclair? Actually, Elena brought me, Victoria. Sighed, standing and smoothing her skirts. She's had an idea about how we might help the Henderson family without putting them in direct danger. Elena stood as well, her dark eyes bright with determination. I still have access to Senator Morrison's house, she explained. I could return tonight, take back my position, and learn more about his plans. If we know exactly when he intends to act, perhaps we can prepare a defense, Cole frowned. That's too dangerous. If Morrison suspects you've told anyone about his activities, he won't hesitate to hurt you. He will hurt the Hendersons anyway, Elena replied. And then he will move on to the next family, and the next. Someone must stop him. Victoria stepped closer to Cole, her voice low but urgent. She's right, you know. Morrison's pattern is escalating. If we don't act now, more families will suffer. Cole studied both women, recognizing the same kind of courage he'd seen in wild horses, who chose to fight rather than flee when cornered. Elena and Victoria were prepared to take significant risks to protect people they barely knew, and their willingness to act shamed his own hesitation. If you go back, Cole said to Elena, you don't go alone. We'll establish a way for you to communicate with us regularly. And at the first sign of danger, you get out. Elena nodded eagerly. See, I understand. What about the Hendersons themselves? James asked. Shouldn't they be warned? Carefully, Victoria said. Old Tom Henderson is proud, and his son Jack has a temper. If they know what's coming, They might do something rash that could make the situation worse. Cole appreciated Victoria's tactical thinking. She understood people the way he understood horses, recognizing that different individuals required different approaches to achieve the best outcomes. "I'll talk to Tom," Cole decided. "Feel him out, see if there's a way to increase their security without revealing what we know." That evening, Cole rode to the Henderson Ranch alone, arriving just as the family was finishing their supper. Tom Henderson was indeed a proud man, weathered by decades of hard work, but still strong despite his 70 years. His son Jack had inherited his father's stubborn streak, along with his broad shoulders and quick temper. "Cole Matheson," Tom said, rising from his chair on the front porch. "Heard you were back in the valley. Sorry about your pa's condition." "Thank you, Tom. I was hoping we could talk about some concerns I have regarding ranch security in general." Tom's eyes sharpened. "What kind of concerns?" Cole chose his words carefully, explaining that he'd heard rumors about increased crime in the territory, cattle rustling and property damage that suggested organized criminal activity. He suggested that neighboring ranchers should look out for each other, perhaps establish regular check-ins and improved security measures. "You're talking about Morrison," Jack Henderson said bluntly, his face flushed with anger. "That snake's been circling our property for months, making offers that are really threats." "Jack," his father warned, but the younger man continued. "He's forced out half our neighbors, Pa. The Carlsons, the Weatherbys, all the families that made this valley worth living in. When are we going to admit that he's not going to stop until he owns everything?" Tom Henderson studied Cole's face with the shrewd intelligence of a man who'd survived 40 years on the frontier. "You know something specific, don't you?" Cole made a decision that went against his cautious instincts. "I know that Morrison's methods are escalating beyond financial pressure. I can't give you details, but I strongly recommend that you and your family be especially vigilant over the next week or two." Jack started to ask for more information, but his father silenced him with a look. "We appreciate the warning," Tom said simply. "The Hendersons have always been able to take care of themselves." "I know," Cole replied. "But if you need help, the Matheson Ranch is only an hour's ride away." On the ride home, Cole reflected on how much his perspective had changed in just a few days. 3 years ago, he would have focused entirely on his own family's problems, avoiding any involvement in community conflicts. Now he found himself committed to protecting neighbors he barely knew, working with a woman who challenged him to be better than he'd ever thought possible. He arrived at the ranch to find Victoria still there, sitting with his father in the upstairs bedroom while James and Alina talked quietly on the front porch. Cole climbed the stairs and found Victoria reading aloud from one of Jeremiah's favorite books, her voice bringing life to the familiar words. "How's he doing?" Cole asked softly. "Holding his own," Victoria replied, setting the book aside. "He's been telling me stories about your childhood, particularly your first attempts at horse training." Jeremiah's eyes twinkled with amusement despite his weakness. "Remember that paint pony, Cole? The one that dumped you in the creek 6 times before you figured out how to stay on?" Cole smiled at the memory. "Thunder. He taught me more about persistence than any horse since." "Your father's very proud of you," Victoria said. "He's been explaining your training methods to me, how you work with the horse's natural instincts rather than against them." "It's the only way that really works," Cole said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Force and intimidation might produce quick results, but they don't create lasting trust." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed similar principles apply to medical practice. Patients respond better when they feel understood rather than simply commanded." As the evening progressed, Cole found himself drawn into a 3-way conversation about patience, trust, and the delicate balance between guidance and coercion. Victoria's insights about human nature complemented his understanding of animal behavior, creating a dialogue that was both intellectually stimulating and personally revealing. When Victoria finally prepared to leave, Cole walked her to her buggy. Under a sky brilliant with stars, the night air was warm and sweet with the scent of prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. "Your father is remarkable," Victoria said as she climbed into the buggy. "His mind is still so sharp, and his stories about the early days of the valley are fascinating." "He's always been a student of human nature," Cole replied. "It's what made him successful as a rancher and a community leader." Victoria gathered her reins, then paused to look down at him. "May I ask you something personal?" Cole nodded, though. He braced himself for questions about Sarah or his years of self-imposed exile. "Earlier today, when you agreed to help Elena despite the risks, what changed your mind? You seemed hesitant at first." Cole considered the question, trying to articulate something he was still figuring out himself. "I think I realized that staying safe isn't the same thing as staying alive. For 3 years, I've avoided any situation that might require me to choose between my own comfort and other people's welfare. But that's not really living, it's just existing." Victoria's smile was visible even in the starlight. "That's very wise and very brave." "I don't feel particularly brave. Mostly I feel terrified that I'll make the wrong choices and hurt people I care about." "The fact that you're terrified is probably what makes you trustworthy," Victoria said. Gently, men who aren't afraid of the consequences of their actions are usually the ones who cause the most damage. As her buggy disappeared down the road toward town, Cole stood in the ranch yard thinking about courage and responsibility. The wild horses he'd trained had taught him that real strength wasn't about dominating through force, but about earning trust through consistent, patient action. Victoria Sinclair was teaching him that the same principles applied to human relationships. The next morning, Cole and James rode out to examine Morrison's horses. The facility was located in a box canyon north of town, a natural enclosure that had been enhanced with additional fencing to create a secure holding area. The horses themselves were magnificent, 8 mares ranging in age from 3 to 6 years, all showing the lean strength and intelligent eyes that marked superior breeding. But it was the stallion that took Cole's breath away. The horse was a magnificent buckskin, probably 7 years old and standing at least 16 hands high. His coat gleamed like polished gold in the morning sunlight, and his dark mane flowed like silk when he moved. But what struck Cole most was the stallion's eyes, intelligent, defiant, and filled with a rage that spoke of serious mistreatment. "Beautiful, isn't he?" Morrison said, joining them at the fence. "And completely unmanageable. He's already put 2 trainers in the hospital." Cole studied the horse's movement, noting the slight favor of his left hind leg and the way he held his head that suggested possible mouth injuries. What methods did they use? Standard braking techniques. Ropes, hobbles, forced submission. Nothing worked. Cole felt his jaw tighten. The stallion's behavior made perfect sense now. He'd been traumatized by brutal treatment and was simply defending himself against further abuse. No amount of force would ever earn this horse's cooperation. Only patience and respect had any chance of success. "I'll need to work with him alone," Cole said. "No other trainers, no observers except my brother. And I'll need access to proper equipment, softer bits, better halters, feed that's appropriate." "For his condition," Morrison nodded. "Whatever you require." "When can you start?" Cole looked at the stallion again, seeing past the anger to the intelligence and nobility underneath. This horse wasn't broken. He was simply afraid and defensive. Given time and proper treatment, he could become something extraordinary. "Tomorrow," Cole decided. "But I want it understood that this horse won't be ready for weeks, possibly months. Real training can't be rushed." "I understand," Morrison said, though his tone suggested impatience. "The contract specifies completion within 6 weeks." Cole almost refused then and there, but the thought of his family's desperate financial situation kept him silent. 6 weeks was barely enough time to gain the stallion's trust, much less complete his training. But they needed Morrison's money, and Cole was confident in his abilities. That afternoon, Cole returned to the canyon alone to begin the delicate process of assessment and initial contact. The stallion watched him approach with ears flat against his skull, every muscle tensed for fight or flight. Cole moved slowly, speaking in the low, soothing tones that had calmed countless frightened animals. "Easy, boy," he murmured, stopping well outside the horse's comfort zone. "Nobody's going to hurt you today." For an hour, Cole simply stood at the fence, letting the stallion grow accustomed to his presence. Gradually, the horse's ears came forward, and his posture relaxed slightly. It was a small victory, but Cole knew that every relationship with a wild horse began with such tiny steps toward trust. As he worked, Cole found himself thinking about Victoria and the parallels between taming wild horses and opening human hearts. Both required patience, consistency, and the wisdom to know when to advance and when to retreat. Both demanded that the trainer be worthy of the trust they sought to earn. The stallion eventually approached the fence, curiosity overcoming caution. Cole remained motionless, letting the horse investigate him at his own pace. When the stallion finally allowed Cole to touch his muzzle through the fence rails, it felt like a breakthrough as significant as any he'd ever achieved. "That's it," Cole whispered, his voice filled with wonder at the connection forming between them. "We're going to be partners, you and I." The sun was setting when Cole finally left the canyon, his mind already planning the careful progression of trust-building exercises that would transform the angry, frightened stallion into a willing partner. It would be the most challenging training project of his career, but also potentially the most rewarding. At home, he found Victoria waiting on the front porch again, this time with news that made his blood run cold. Elena had returned to Morrison's house as planned, but her first report suggested that their timeline was even shorter than expected. "He's planning to move against the Hendersons tomorrow night," Victoria said without preamble. Elena overheard him talking to 2 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking types who aren't from around here. Cole sank into the chair beside her, his mind racing through possible responses. They'd hoped for more time to plan and prepare, but Morrison was clearly eager to accelerate his consolidation of Valley properties. What exactly is he planning? A fire meant to look accidental. The barn first, then possibly the house if the family doesn't agree to sell immediately. The casual cruelty of the plan stunned Cole. Morrison was willing to risk the lives of an entire family simply to acquire their property more quickly. It was the kind of ruthless calculation that revealed the true nature of the man behind the respectable facade. "We have to warn them," James said, emerging from the house where he'd apparently been listening. "We will," Cole agreed. "But we also have to be smart about this. If we simply tell the Hendersons what we know, they'll either dismiss it as gossip or confront Morrison directly. Either way, innocent people could get hurt." Victoria leaned forward, her storm-gray eyes intense with concentration. "What if we gave them a reason to be elsewhere tomorrow night? Some kind of emergency that would require the entire family to leave the ranch?" Cole considered the suggestion, appreciating Victoria's tactical thinking. If they could get the Hendersons away from their property without revealing the specific threat, they might be able to protect the family while gathering evidence of Morrison's criminal activities. "Dr. Sinclair," he said slowly, "how would you feel about having a medical emergency tomorrow evening? Something that would require the Hendersons' immediate assistance." Victoria's smile was fierce and determined. "I think that could be arranged." The plan unfolded with clockwork precision the following evening. Victoria had sent word to the Henderson ranch that she was treating a severely injured traveler at her clinic and desperately needed assistance from anyone with strong backs and steady nerves. Tom Henderson and his son Jack had responded immediately. bringing their wagon and leaving their ranch under cover of darkness. Just as Cole had hoped, Cole and James positioned themselves in the hills overlooking the Henderson property. Armed with rifles and a camera that Cole had borrowed from the newspaper office in Cedar Ridge, if Morrison's men attempted arson as Alina had warned, they would have witnesses and evidence to present to the territorial marshal. The night was moonless and cold, with clouds scudding across the star-filled sky like dark ships on a celestial ocean. Cole lay on his belly among the pine trees, his rifle ready and his eyes fixed on the ranch buildings below. Beside him, James checked his pocket watch for the dozenth time, the soft click of the cover opening and closing a nervous rhythm in the darkness. "They should have been here by now," James whispered. "Patience," Cole replied, though he felt the same tension. Criminal activities rarely follow precise schedules. At midnight, they finally saw movement. 3 riders approached the Henderson ranch from the east, moving carefully and staying in the shadows wherever possible. Even in the dim starlight, Cole could tell these weren't local men. Their posture and equipment spoke of hired professionals, the kind of men who made their living through intimidation and violence. "There," James breathed, pointing toward the barn. 2 of the riders had dismounted and were approaching the large wooden structure with deliberate purpose. Cole could see them carrying what appeared to be cans of kerosene, confirming Elena's intelligence about the planned arson. The 3rd man remained mounted, watching the approaches and ready to alert his companions to any danger. Cole carefully adjusted the camera, grateful for the technical knowledge Father Miguel had shared during their conversations about documenting frontier life. The evidence they gathered tonight could be crucial in stopping Morrison's predatory scheme, but only if the photographs were clear enough to identify the perpetrators. The first flames appeared at the base of the barn's eastern wall, small and controlled initially, but growing rapidly as the dry wood caught fire. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed in orange and yellow light that danced wildly against the surrounding darkness. The hired arsonists mounted their horses and retreated to a safe distance, clearly planning to observe the results of their work. Cole began photographing frantically, using the fire's light to capture images of the men's faces and horses. The camera's flash powder would have given away their position, so he had to rely on the natural illumination and hope for the best. Beside him, James took careful notes about timing and the sequence of events, creating a written record to supplement the photographic evidence. That's when everything went wrong. A 4th rider emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the ranch, moving fast and directly toward the burning barn. Cole's heart lurched as he recognized the horse and rider, Jack Henderson, returning ahead of schedule and heading straight into danger. "Damn," Cole muttered, passing the camera to James. "Jack's come back early. What do we do?" Cole was already moving, abandoning their concealed position and scrambling down the hillside toward the ranch. "You keep taking pictures. I'm going to try to keep him alive." The descent was treacherous in the darkness, loose rocks and hidden branches threatening to send Cole tumbling with each step. Behind him, he could hear James calling his name, but there was no time to explain or coordinate their response. Jack Henderson was riding directly toward 3 armed criminals, and he had no idea of the danger he faced. Cole reached the bottom of the hill just as Jack dismounted near the burning barn, calling out for his family and trying to determine if anyone was trapped inside the structure. The 3 arsonists had seen him too, and they were converging on his position with weapons drawn. "Jack!" Cole shouted, emerging from the trees at a run. "Get down!" The young rancher spun toward Cole's voice, confusion and alarm warring in his expression. He opened his mouth to respond just as the first gunshot echoed across the valley, the bullet chipping bark from a tree inches from Jack's head. Cole dove forward, tackling Jack behind the ranch house's woodpile, just as 2 more shots rang out. Splinters exploded from the logs above their heads, and Cole could hear the arsonists shouting to each other as they positioned themselves for a better angle of attack. "What the hell is going on?" Jack demanded, his face streaked with soot and his eyes wide with shock. "Morrison hired those men to burn you out," Cole explained tersely, checking his rifle. "Your family's safe. Dr. Sinclair got them away from here on a medical pretext." Jack's expression shifted from confusion to fury. "That bastard. I knew. He was behind the other fires." "Right now, let's focus on staying alive," Cole said. "How many guns do you have in the house?" "Pa's shotgun and my rifle, plus ammunition. But we'd have to cross open ground to reach them." Cole assessed their situation. With the tactical thinking he'd learned during his brief stint in the territorial militia, 3 armed men had them pinned behind insufficient cover. The burning barn was providing too much light for concealment, and their only weapons were Cole's rifle and whatever Jack might be carrying. "You armed?" Jack nodded, drawing a Colt revolver from his holster. 6 shots, plus what's in your rifle. "Not enough for a sustained fight," Cole concluded. "We need to even the odds or find better cover." The decision was made for them when one of the arsonists circled around the ranch house, trying to flank their position. Cole heard the man's boots crunching on gravel and turned just in time to see a muzzle flash in the darkness. The bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Cole's return shot was instinctive and accurate, the man dropping with a cry of pain that suggested a wound rather than a kill. But the exchange of gunfire had revealed their exact position to the other 2 attackers, who immediately began concentrating their fire on the woodpile. "We can't stay here," Cole told Jack. "When I say run, head for the creek bed behind the house. Stay low and don't stop until you reach the willows. What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. On 3, 1, 2, run." They broke from cover simultaneously, sprinting across the open ground toward the safety of the creek bed. Jack made it safely, disappearing into the shadows beneath the willow trees. Cole was 3 steps behind when something slammed into his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. The pain was immediate and intense, a burning sensation that radiated down his arm and across his chest. Cole rolled behind a water trough, gasping for breath and trying to assess the damage. His shirt was already soaked with blood, and his left arm was rapidly losing strength and mobility. "Cole," Jack's voice carried across the distance, filled with concern and guilt. "Stay put." Cole called back, though the effort of shouting made his shoulder throb even more intensely. "I'm all right." It was a lie, but Jack didn't need to know that. Cole could feel the warm wetness spreading across his chest, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. The bullet had struck high on his shoulder, possibly damaging the collarbone or shoulder blade. Without medical attention, he would rapidly lose the ability to fight effectively. The arsonists seemed to realize they'd scored a hit, because their fire became more concentrated and aggressive. Bullets rang against the metal water trough with sharp, metallic impacts, and Cole could hear them calling to each other as they coordinated their final assault. That's when the cavalry arrived. James appeared at the top of the hill, no longer concerned with concealment. He was mounted on his horse and carrying both a rifle and what appeared to be a torch made from fence post and kerosene-soaked rags. As Cole watched in amazement, his younger brother lit the improvised torch and spurred his horse into a wild charge down the hillside, yelling like a Comanche warrior. The psychological effect was immediate and dramatic. The arsonists, already nervous about the extended gunfight and their wounded companion, apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They began withdrawing toward their horses, firing sporadic shots to cover their retreat. James reached the bottom of the hill and threw his torch directly at the nearest attacker's horse. The animal reared in terror, dumping its rider and bolting into the darkness. The fallen man scrambled to his feet and ran after his companions, abandoning any pretense of completing their mission. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats was fading into the distance, leaving behind only the crackling of the burning barn and the ringing in Cole's ears from the gunshots. James dismounted and ran to the water trough, his face pale with concern as he saw the blood spreading across his brother's shirt. "How bad?" James asked, helping Cole sit up against the trough. "Bad enough," Cole admitted, wincing as movement sent fresh waves of pain through his shoulder. "The bullet's still in there, and I'm losing blood faster than I'd like." Jack emerged from the creek bed, his revolver still drawn and his eyes scanning the darkness for any remaining threats. When he saw Cole's condition, his expression shifted to one of profound gratitude mixed with guilt. "You saved my life," Jack said simply. "That bullet was meant for me." "Just returning a favor," Cole replied, trying to maintain his composure despite the increasing pain. "Your family's been good to ours over the years. We need to get you to Dr. Sinclair," James said, already moving toward his horse. "Can you ride?" Cole tested his ability to move his injured arm, grimacing at the results. "Not well, but I can. Manage if you can help me mount." The ride to Cedar Ridge was a nightmare of jarring pain and growing weakness. Cole clung to his saddle horn with his good arm, while James led his horse through the darkness, taking the smoothest route possible, but unable to eliminate the constant motion that sent spikes of agony through his wounded shoulder. By the time they reached Victoria's clinic, Cole was barely conscious, slumping forward in his saddle and held upright only by James's steadying hand. Light blazed from every window of the small building, and Victoria herself emerged before they'd even dismounted, her medical bag in hand and her face grim with professional determination. "What happened?" she demanded, helping James lower Cole from his horse. "Gunshot wound to the left shoulder," James reported as they carried Cole toward the clinic door. "He's lost a lot of blood." Inside, Victoria's clinic was a model of frontier medical efficiency. Clean white sheets covered the examination table, surgical instruments gleamed in glass cases, and the smell of carbolic acid spoke of serious attention to sanitation and infection prevention. Victoria wasted no time on sympathy or reassurance, immediately beginning her examination with the focused intensity of someone trained to save lives under difficult conditions. "The bullet's lodged against the shoulder blade," she announced after several minutes of careful probing. "It missed the major blood vessels, but there's significant muscle damage and possible bone fragments. I'll need to extract it immediately." "Do it," Cole said through gritted teeth. "But first, we need to send word to the territorial marshal. We have evidence of Morrison's involvement in tonight's arson." Victoria paused in her preparations, looking back and forth between Cole and James. "Evidence?" James pulled out the camera and the notebook containing his observations, photographs and detailed notes about the attack. "We can prove Morrison hired those men to burn out the Hendersons." "That changes everything," Victoria said. "Alina's been gathering additional information about Morrison's other illegal activities. Combined with tonight's evidence, we might finally have enough to stop him." As Victoria prepared her surgical instruments, Cole found himself thinking about the events of the evening and what they meant for his family and community. He'd been shot defending a neighbor, had gathered evidence against a criminal, and was now depending on the skill of a woman he was rapidly falling in love with to preserve his life and health. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a solitary horse trainer in Copper Falls, avoiding emotional connections and community responsibilities. Now he was lying on a doctor's table, wounded in defense of his neighbors and planning to testify against one of the territory's most powerful men. The transformation was so complete that he barely recognized himself. "This is going to hurt," Victoria warned, selecting a gleaming surgical probe from her instrument tray. "It already hurts," Cole replied. "Just get it done." Victoria's hands were steady and sure as she worked, her professional training evident in every careful movement. The pain was excruciating, But Cole found himself watching her face rather than focusing on the surgery itself. Her storm gray eyes were intent and focused, her jaw set with determination, and her auburn hair caught the lamplight like burnished copper. "There," she said finally, dropping the extracted bullet into a metal pan with a satisfying clink. "Now we clean the wound thoroughly and stitch you up." As Victoria worked on cleaning and bandaging his shoulder, Cole felt a strange sense of completion, as if events had conspired to bring him to exactly where he needed to be. He was home with his family, committed to protecting his community, and falling in love with a woman who shared his values and challenged him to be better than he'd ever thought possible. "You realize this means war," James said quietly, settling into a chair beside the examination table. "Morrison won't just forget about tonight. When he learns we have evidence against him, he'll escalate his attacks." "Let him come," Cole said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "We're not the isolated, struggling families he's been targeting. We have allies, evidence, and the law on our side." Victoria finished her work and stepped back to admire her handiwork. The bandage was clean and professionally applied, and Cole could already feel some relief from the constant throbbing in his shoulder. "You'll need to rest that arm for at least 2 weeks," she instructed. "No heavy lifting, no sudden movements, and definitely no more gunfights." "What about the horses?" Cole asked. "Morrison's contract specifies completion within 6 weeks, and I've barely started working with the stallion." Victoria and James exchanged glances that Cole couldn't quite interpret. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps it's time to reconsider whether that contract is in your family's best interests. Working for Morrison puts you in a compromised position, especially now that you're actively opposing his criminal activities." Cole had been thinking the same thing, but the financial implications were sobering. Without Morrison's payment, the ranch would still face foreclosure, and his father would die knowing that his life's work had been lost. "We'll find another way," James said firmly, apparently reading Cole's thoughts. "The evidence we gathered tonight will stop Morrison's predatory lending practices. Other families will be able to keep their ranches, and we'll figure out how to save ours without compromising our principles." As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Cole reflected on how much his life had changed in less than a week. He'd returned home expecting to help with his father's death and the ranch's failure. Instead, he'd found love, purpose, and a community worth fighting for. The battle with Morrison was far from over, but for the first time since reading James's telegram, Cole felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he wouldn't face them alone. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later, a weathered man named Daniel Garrett, who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with frontier violence. He examined the photographic evidence and witness statements with the methodical thoroughness of a career lawman, asking pointed questions and taking detailed notes. "This is substantial evidence," Marshal Garrett concluded, setting down the photographs Cole and James had taken during the arson attempt. "But Morrison's a clever man with expensive lawyers. We'll need more than pictures and testimony to make charges stick in territorial court." Cole shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his wounded shoulder protesting the movement, despite Victoria's skilled treatment. The injury was healing well, but it served as a constant reminder of how dangerous their situation had become. "What kind of additional evidence?" Victoria asked. She'd been present for the marshal's entire interview, serving as both Cole's physician and the community's unofficial advocate. "Financial records, correspondence, proof of the organized nature of his criminal enterprise," Garrett explained. "The kind of documentation that shows pattern and intent, not just isolated incidents." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward from her position near the window, her dark eyes bright with determination. "I can get those records," she said quietly. "Senor, Morrison keeps everything in his office safe. I clean that office every morning while he conducts business downstairs in the bank. Marshal Garrett studied Elena with the assessing gaze of a man evaluating potential assets and liabilities. That would be dangerous, miss. If Morrison suspects you're working against him, he won't hesitate to silence you permanently. He will do that anyway once he discovers I warned the Hendersons, Elena replied. At least this way, I can help. Stop him before he hurts more families. Cole admired Elena's courage, but the plan filled him with unease. They were asking a young woman to risk her life gathering evidence against a man who'd already demonstrated his willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. There has to be another way, Cole said. We can't put Elena in that kind of danger. Actually, Victoria interjected, there might be a way to minimize the risk. Morrison's planning to attend the Harvest Festival this weekend. He never misses an opportunity to be seen as a pillar of the community. If Elena could access his office while he's occupied at the festival... Marshal Garrett nodded approvingly. A public event would provide the perfect alibi. Morrison couldn't harm Miss Rodriguez without drawing attention to himself. The plan took shape over the next hour, with each participant understanding their role in what amounted to a coordinated intelligence operation. Elena would enter Morrison's office during the festival's peak hours, photograph or copy any incriminating documents she could find. Cole and James would maintain surveillance on Morrison himself, ensuring he remained at the festival and didn't return to his office unexpectedly. Victoria would serve as Elena's backup, ready to provide medical assistance or an emergency alibi if something went wrong. There's one more thing, Marshal Garrett said as the meeting concluded. Morrison's hired gun, the man who organized the arson attempt, is still in the territory. My sources indicate he's recruiting additional men for some kind of major operation. You should all be extremely careful until we can bring Morrison to justice. The warning cast a shadow over their careful planning, but it also reinforced the urgency of their mission. Morrison was escalating his criminal activities, and innocent families would continue to suffer until he was stopped. That evening, Cole made his way to the canyon where Morrison's horses were penned, determined to continue his work with the magnificent buckskin stallion despite his injury. The horse had made remarkable progress during their brief sessions, gradually overcoming his fear and beginning to trust Cole's gentle approach. The stallion approached the fence as soon as Cole appeared, nickering softly in greeting. The transformation was remarkable. The angry defensive animal of a week ago had been replaced by a curious, intelligent horse who seemed to genuinely enjoy Cole's company. "Hello, Thunder," Cole said softly, using the name he'd given the stallion in honor of his childhood pony. "Ready for another lesson?" Working with his left arm immobilized in a sling, Cole had to modify his training technique significantly. But the enforced slowness actually seemed to benefit the process, allowing Thunder to approach each new challenge at his own pace without feeling pressured or threatened. As Cole worked with Thunder on basic halter training, his mind kept returning to his conversation with Victoria the previous evening. She'd come to check on his wound and had stayed to share dinner with the family, her presence bringing warmth and laughter to what might otherwise have been a somber meal dominated by worry about Morrison's next move. "You've been thinking," Victoria had observed as they sat on the front porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the prairie. "I can practically see the wheels turning in your head." "Just trying to figure out how we got here," Cole had replied. 2 weeks ago, my biggest concern was training difficult horses. Now I'm plotting against territorial criminals and falling in love with the most remarkable woman I've ever met. Victoria had turned to look at him then, her storm-gray eyes reflecting the last light of evening. "And how do you feel about that transformation?" "Terrified," Cole had admitted, "but also more alive than I've felt in years." Now as he watched Thunder respond to his guidance with growing trust and cooperation, Cole reflected on the parallels between taming wild horses and opening human hearts. Both required patience, consistency, and the willingness to be vulnerable. Both demanded that trust be earned rather than forced. "The thing about trust," Cole murmured to Thunder as the horse allowed him to touch his neck, "is that it can't be faked or rushed. It has to be built one small gesture at a time." Thunder whickered softly, as if in agreement. The horse's transformation reminded Cole of his own journey back to emotional engagement with the world. Like Thunder, he'd been wounded by past experiences and had learned to defend himself through isolation and mistrust. But Victoria's patience and genuine care had gradually worn down his defenses, showing him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but rather the foundation of real strength. The harvest festival dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made everyone grateful to be alive and living in Montana territory. The entire community gathered in Cedar Ridge's main square, which had been decorated with corn stalks, pumpkins, and colorful bunting that fluttered in the gentle breeze. Cole positioned himself near the bandstand where Morrison was scheduled to deliver a speech about community progress and economic development. The irony of the man responsible for driving families from their homes, speaking about community welfare, wasn't lost on anyone who knew the truth about his activities. Morrison arrived precisely on schedule, dressed in his finest suit and accompanied by several prominent citizens who seemed unaware of his criminal enterprises. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, shaking hands and making conversation with the skill of a born politician. "Hard to believe that's the face of evil," James observed, joining Cole near the bandstand. "He looks like everybody's favorite uncle." "The most dangerous predators are usually the ones who blend in perfectly," Cole replied, keeping his voice low. "They succeed because people trust them." As Morrison began his speech about prosperity and progress, Cole caught sight of Elena moving quietly along the edge of the crowd. She wore her best dress and carried a basket of flowers, playing the role of a young woman enjoying the festival. To any casual observer, she appeared completely innocent and carefree, but Cole could see the tension in her posture, the way her eyes continually scanned the crowd for potential threats. The courage required for what she was about to attempt was extraordinary, and Cole found himself praying to whatever divine forces might be listening to keep her safe. "The future of our valley depends on strong leadership and sound business practices," Morrison declared from the bandstand, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Together, we can build a community that prosperity and stability for generations to come." The applause was polite, but not enthusiastic. Cole noticed that many of the valley's established ranchers seemed uncomfortable with Morrison's rhetoric, perhaps sensing the gap between his public statements and his private actions. Elena disappeared into the crowd, heading toward the bank building where Morrison's office waited. Cole checked his pocket watch. She would have approximately 30 minutes before Morrison's speech concluded, and he might return to conduct business. The waiting was agony. Cole found himself watching Morrison's face for any sign that he suspected something was wrong, while simultaneously trying to track Elena's progress through the festival crowd. Every minute felt like an hour, and Cole's wounded shoulder throbbed in rhythm with his elevated pulse. "She'll be fine," Victoria said quietly, appearing at his elbow with the silent grace that seemed to characterize all her movements. "Elena's resourceful and careful. She knows what she's doing." "I know," Cole replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I just hate putting someone else at risk for our battles." "It's not just our battle," Victoria reminded him. "Morrison's hurt Elena's family too. Her little brother nearly died because Morrison's policies made it impossible for immigrant families to afford proper medical care. She has her own reasons for wanting him stopped." As Morrison's speech reached its climax, Cole spotted Elena emerging from the bank building, her flower basket now noticeably heavier than when she'd entered. She moved through the crowd with studied casualness, stopping to admire various festival displays and chat with acquaintances as if she hadn't a care in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison concluded, "I pledge to you that Cedar Ridge will continue to grow and prosper under responsible leadership. Thank you for your attention and your continued support." The applause was more enthusiastic this time, though Cole suspected it had more to do with the speech ending than with its content. As Morrison stepped down from the bandstand, Elena reached the predetermined rendezvous point near the church, where Victoria was waiting with a medical emergency that would provide cover for any suspicious behavior. "It's done," Elena said simply, opening her basket to reveal a collection of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be a small ledger book. "Senator Morrison keeps very detailed records of his criminal activities." Marshal Garrett, who had been posing as a visiting rancher, appeared at their group with the speed of a man accustomed to moving quickly when circumstances required. He examined Elena's findings with growing excitement, his weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile Cole had seen from him. "This is it," Garrett said quietly. "Financial records, correspondence with hired criminals, detailed plans for property acquisition through illegal means. We have enough evidence to charge Morrison with conspiracy, arson, extortion, and half a dozen other territorial crimes." The moment of triumph was interrupted by a commotion near the bandstand. Morrison was engaged in heated conversation with two men Cole didn't recognize, their body language suggesting urgency and alarm. One of the men pointed toward the bank building, and Morrison's face went pale with rage. "He knows," Victoria said, following Cole's gaze. "Someone must have seen Elena entering the building." Morrison's eyes swept the crowd with predatory intensity, searching for the person responsible for violating his private sanctuary. When his gaze fell on Elena, standing near the church with her incriminating basket, his expression shifted to cold fury. "Time to go," Marshal Garrett said, his hand moving instinctively toward his concealed weapon. "Morrison's not going to wait for legal proceedings to settle this matter." But Morrison was already moving, pushing through the crowd with his hired men flanking him like wolves closing in on prey. The festival's cheerful atmosphere began to shift as people sensed the undercurrent of violence and moved away from the approaching confrontation. "Elena," Cole called out, "get behind the church, now." Elena didn't need to be told twice. She disappeared around the building just as Morrison and his men reached the spot where she'd been standing. The banker's face was twisted with rage, and Cole could see the bulge of a concealed weapon beneath his expensive jacket. "Where is she?" Morrison demanded, his cultured voice cracking with fury. "Where's the little thief who violated my property?" "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria replied with the kind of calm professionalism that would have been admirable under other circumstances. Morrison's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Dr. Sinclair, I expected better from someone of your education and social standing. Harboring criminals is hardly appropriate behavior for a respected physician." "Neither is burning out innocent families," Cole said, stepping forward despite his injured shoulder. "But that hasn't stopped you from terrorizing half the valley." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he focused on Cole, recognizing him as the primary threat to his criminal enterprise. "Mr. Matheson, I should have known you'd be involved in this theft. Your family always did have more pride than sense." "Pride's not what's driving us," Cole replied. "Justice is." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Marshal Garrett's deputies had arrived, apparently summoned by a prearranged signal. They surrounded Morrison and his men with professional efficiency, weapons drawn and expressions grim. "Samuel Morrison," Marshal Garrett announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, arson, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to legal representation, but I suggest you cooperate fully with our investigation." Morrison's face cycled through shock, rage, and finally a kind of resigned calculation. He was a man accustomed to finding angles and escape routes, and Cole could almost see him evaluating his options. "This is a mistake, Marshal," Morrison said with forced calm. "I'm a respected businessman with powerful friends in the territorial government. You'll regret this harassment of an innocent citizen." "The only thing I regret," Garrett replied, "is that it took this long to gather enough evidence to stop you." As the deputies led Morrison away in shackles, Cole felt a profound sense of completion wash over him. The man who had threatened his family and terrorized his community was finally facing justice, and the evidence Elena had risked her life to obtain would ensure that other families would be safe from his predatory schemes. Victoria appeared at his side, her hand slipping into his uninjured arm. "It's over," she said softly. "Morrison's finished, and the valley is safe." "This part's over," Cole agreed. "But I think our story is just beginning." As the festival crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the dramatic arrests, Cole looked around at the faces of his neighbors and felt a deep sense of belonging. These were his people, this was his home, and Victoria Sinclair was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life protecting and loving. The wild horses had taught him patience and trust, but Victoria had taught him something even more valuable: the courage to open his heart and fight for what truly mattered. 6 weeks after Morrison's arrest, Cole stood in the center of the training corral, watching Thunder respond to voice commands with the grace and intelligence that marked him as truly exceptional. The stallion's transformation had been remarkable. From the angry, traumatized animal Morrison's men had brutalized into a willing partner who seemed to anticipate Cole's every request. "Easy, Thunder," Cole murmured, raising his left hand. Slightly. The stallion immediately shifted from a trot to a walk. His ears pricked forward and his attention focused entirely on his trainer. The injured shoulder had healed completely, leaving Cole with full range of motion and only the faintest scar to remind him of the night he'd been wounded defending his neighbors. Victoria approached the corral fence, her medical bag in one hand and a picnic basket in the other. She'd made it a habit to visit the ranch during her afternoon rounds, ostensibly to check on Jeremir's condition, but really to spend time with Cole and witness his remarkable work with the horses. "He's beautiful," Victoria said, settling onto the fence rail with practiced ease. Over the past weeks, she'd become comfortable with ranch life in a way that seemed natural rather than forced. "I can hardly believe this is the same horse Morrison claimed was untrainable." "He was never untrainable," Cole replied, guiding Thunder through a series of turning exercises. "He was just afraid and angry. Once he learned to trust again, his natural intelligence took over." Victoria watched the interaction between man and horse with the keen observation skills that made her such an effective physician. What she saw was a partnership built on mutual respect rather than dominance, a relationship that seemed to reflect Cole's own philosophy about life and love. "There's something poetic about it," she observed. "The man who gentles wild horses finding his own wildness tamed by love." Cole brought Thunder to a halt in front of the fence, the stallion's golden coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "Who says I've been tamed?" he asked with a grin that made Victoria's heart skip. "Haven't you?" Victoria challenged, meeting his gaze with those storm-gray eyes that had captivated him from their first meeting on the train. "The Cole Matheson I met 6 weeks ago was running from emotional connections, convinced he was better off alone. This Cole seems to have discovered that some things are worth the risk of getting hurt." Cole stepped closer to the fence, close enough to smell the lavender soap Victoria used and see the flecks of silver in her eyes. "Maybe I didn't get tamed so much as I found someone worth being brave for." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. James rode into the ranch yard leading a string of horses, his face bright with the kind of excitement that suggested good news. Behind him came Tom Henderson and his son Jack, both men looking considerably more prosperous than they had during the dark days of Morrison's threats. "Cole," James called out, dismounting near the corral, "you need to see this." Cole secured Thunder's lead rope and joined the group, curious about what had brought them together. Tom Henderson stepped forward, his weathered face creased with emotion. "Cole, we wanted to thank you properly for what you did," Tom said. "Jack and I have been talking with the other families Morrison targeted, and we've come up with something we hope you'll accept." Jack stepped forward, leading a magnificent chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and perfect conformation. "This is Sunset," he said. "She's from our best bloodline, trained for both ranch work and racing. We want you to have her as payment for the debt we owe you." Cole examined the mare with a horseman's eye, recognizing immediately that she was exceptional. Her breeding, training, and natural athleticism marked her as the kind of horse most trainers could only dream of working with. "This is too generous," Cole protested. "I didn't help your family expecting payment. That's exactly why you deserve it," Tom replied firmly. "You risked your life for people you barely knew, asking nothing in return. That kind of character deserves recognition." Victoria climbed down from the fence and moved to examine the mare more closely. "She's stunning," she said, running her hands along Sunset's neck with the confidence of someone who'd grown up around horses. "And she seems to have a wonderful temperament." "Dr. Sinclair's right," Jack added. "Sunset's got speed and intelligence, but she's also gentle enough for a lady to ride. We thought ... well, we hoped she might serve dual purposes." The implications of Jack's comment weren't lost on anyone present. The valley's residents had been watching Cole and Victoria's courtship with the interested attention of a close-knit community, and most seemed to approve of the match. "Speaking of dual purposes," James said with barely contained excitement, "there's more news. Marshal Garrett sent word from the territorial capital. Morrison's been convicted on all charges, and his property is being auctioned to pay restitution to his victims." Cole felt a surge of satisfaction at the news. Justice had been served, and the families Morrison had victimized would receive compensation for their losses. "There's something else," James continued. "The territorial government is establishing a new position, Special Deputy for Horse Training and Acquisition. They want someone to help them build a mounted patrol unit for law enforcement across Montana. The salary would be substantial, and the work would involve traveling to different communities to train both horses and riders." The offer was tempting, representing the kind of recognition and financial security Cole had never imagined possible. But it would also mean extensive travel and long separations from home and from Victoria. "It's a remarkable opportunity," Victoria said quietly, though something in her tone suggested mixed feelings about the prospect. Cole studied her face, reading the conflict between her desire for his success and her reluctance to see him leave again. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just as he'd found someone worth staying for, the world was offering him reasons to go. "It is a good opportunity," Cole agreed. "But I've learned something important over the past few weeks. Success means different things to different people, and I'm more interested in building something lasting here than in chasing prestigious positions elsewhere." Victoria's smile was radiant, and Cole felt his decision confirmed by the joy in her eyes. Home wasn't just a place. It was the people who made life worth living. That evening, the Matheson family gathered for dinner in the ranch house dining room, with Victoria, Elena, and the Hendersons joining them for what had become a weekly tradition. Mrs. Henderson had prepared her famous apple pie. Elena contributed fresh bread from her new position at the Cedar Ridge Bakery, and Victoria brought wine from her father's collection that she'd been saving for a special occasion. Jeremiah Matheson presided over the meal from his wheelchair, his condition stabilized enough that he could join family gatherings with assistance. The old man's face glowed with contentment as he watched his sons and their friends share food and laughter around the table where he'd raised his family. "I have an announcement," Jeremiah said as dessert was being served. "I've been in correspondence with the Territorial Land Office, and I'm officially transferring ownership of Broken Arrow Ranch to Cole and James. to be held jointly as equal partners. The news was greeted with surprise and gratitude from both brothers. Cole had expected to inherit a portion of the ranch eventually, but the immediate transfer represented a vote of confidence in their ability to build on their father's legacy. "Pa," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Jeremy replied. "You boys have proven that you can work together to protect what matters. This ranch will be in good hands." As the evening progressed, Cole found himself watching Victoria interact with his family and friends, marveling at how naturally she fit into their lives. She helped Mrs. Henderson clear dishes, discussed medical techniques with Elena, and engaged Jeremiah in conversations about frontier history with genuine interest and respect. After the guests departed, Cole walked Victoria to her buggy under a sky brilliant with stars. The night air was crisp with the promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance, wild horses called to each other across the prairie. "Victoria," Cole said, taking her hands in his, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, her expression patient and encouraging. "What is it?" "I've spent my whole adult life believing I was better off alone, that emotional connections were dangerous luxuries I couldn't afford. But you've shown me that isolation isn't strength. It's just another form of cowardice." Victoria's smile was gentle and understanding. "And what have you decided to do with that revelation?" Cole reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, his heart pounding with the same nervous energy he'd felt before his first attempt at training. "A truly wild horse. I've decided to stop running from the best thing that's ever happened to me." He dropped to one knee beside her buggy, opening the box to reveal the engagement ring he'd originally bought for Sarah, but which now seemed destined for Victoria's hand. "Dr. Victoria Sinclair, will you marry me?" Victoria's intake of breath was audible in the quiet night, and for a moment Cole feared he'd misread her feelings. Then she laughed with pure joy, tears streaming down her face as she nodded enthusiastically. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Cole Matheson, I will marry you." As Cole slipped the ring onto her finger, Victoria looked down at the diamonds sparkling in the starlight. "It's beautiful," she said. "But I have to ask, have you really given up your wild ways, or am I just the latest challenge you've decided to take on?" Cole stood and pulled her into his arms, careful of his recently healed shoulder. "Dr. Sinclair, I can tame wild Mustangs, calm spooked cattle, and gentle the most difficult horses in Montana territory. But you're the one I can't tame, and I wouldn't want to if I could." Victoria's laughter rang across the prairie as Cole kissed her beneath the vast Montana sky. "Good," she said when they finally separated, "because I happen to prefer my cowboys a little wild around the edges." 1 year later, Cole stood at the altar of the Cedar Ridge Church, watching Victoria walk down the aisle in a dress of ivory silk that caught the morning light like captured sunshine. Her father's medical bag sat on the front pew, a symbol of the profession she would continue even after marriage, and her bouquet included wildflowers from the prairie where they'd first realized they were falling in love. The church was packed with friends and neighbors whose lives had been touched by the couple's courage and compassion. Elena Rodriguez sat with her new husband, a young rancher who'd courted her after Morrison's arrest freed her from fear. Tame and Jack Henderson occupied the front row with their wives, representing the families whose ranches had been saved by Cole and Victoria's intervention. James served as best man, his face beaming with happiness for his brother's newfound joy. Jeremiah Matheson sat in his wheelchair at the end of the front pew, his condition stable enough that he'd lived to see both his sons settled and happy. As Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, Cole reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He'd returned home expecting to face failure and loss, but instead he'd found purpose, love, and a community worth fighting for. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the ranch, where tables had been set up in the main corral, and thunder and sunset grazed peacefully in the adjoining pasture. The magnificent stallion had become the foundation of Cole's expanded horse training program, which now served clients throughout the territory. "So what's next for the famous horse trainer and his doctor wife?" Tom Henderson asked as the afternoon wound down. Cole looked around at the ranch that was now truly his home, then at Victoria, who was deep in conversation with several women about establishing a proper hospital for the valley. "I think we're going to build something that lasts," he said. "A legacy that's about more than just training horses or treating patients." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Cole and Victoria stood together at the corral fence, watching thunder nuzzle sunset with the gentle affection of horses who'd chosen each other as mates. "I have a confession," Victoria said, leaning against Cole's shoulder. "When I first met you on that train, I thought you were just another cowboy running away from his responsibilities. And now?" Victoria smiled, her ring catching the last light of evening. "Now I know you're a cowboy who found something worth running toward instead." In the distance, wild horses called to each other across the endless grassland, their voices carrying promises of freedom and adventure. But Cole Matheson was no longer listening for escape routes. He'd found everything he needed right here, in the arms of a woman who'd taught him that the wildest hearts could learn to love without losing their essential nature. The Mustang tamer had finally met his match, and he couldn't have been happier about it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.